Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. Have you ever had the feeling that you're being watched, but when you look around, no one is there? It's unsettling, isn't it? That creeping sensation that tightens your chest, making your heart race, and yet when you turn to check, everything seems perfectly normal, too normal. But that feeling lingers, doesn't it? Like a shadow that you can't shake off. It started innocently enough. I was walking home late one night, the streets mostly empty, just me and the occasional flicker of a street lamp. My footsteps echoed on the pavement, a soft rhythm that calmed me after a long day. The city was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of distant traffic was muffled by the thick, cool air, and the sky above was a deep navy blue, scattered with a few indifferent stars. It was the kind of night that should have felt peaceful, but instead something gnawed at me, a subtle, gnawing unease. The first time I noticed it, I chalked it up to being tired. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't quite pinpoint it, just a vague sense that someone or something was trailing behind me. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was nothing. The wind rustled through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. It was a crisp, chilly night, but this wasn't the kind of cold that was expected. No, this was the kind of cold that felt like it was seeping into my bones, settling in like an unwelcome visitor. I turned a corner and glanced behind me, expecting to see someone. A fellow late-night walker, maybe a stray cat, something, anything. But no one. The street was empty. The glow of the streetlights illuminated nothing but the stretch of sidewalk that seemed to go on forever. I exhaled a sigh of relief, scolding myself for being paranoid. But as I continued walking, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was as if the air itself had become heavier, like I was being pulled down by an invisible weight. My footsteps echoed louder now, but something was different. There was a rhythm to them, a pattern that didn't match mine. It was subtle at first, just the faintest beat of something following me. I stopped again. My heart hammered in my chest as I listened, straining to hear. The street was dead silent, save for the distant rumble of a car and the soft rustle of leaves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting. But nothing. I turned and started walking again, faster this time. The sound of my own footsteps filled my ears, but as I neared another intersection, I heard it again, a faint scuff of shoes on the pavement just a few steps behind me. I whipped around, but once more there was nothing. The street was as empty as it had been before. My pulse quickened and I began to walk faster, my breath shallow as the panic began to creep in. I wasn't crazy. Something was there. It had to be. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, I told myself. You're tired. You've been working too hard. This is nothing. But the sound continued. Faint, soft, like someone was matching my pace, staying just out of sight. And then, for a brief moment, I thought I saw it. A shadow. At the edge of my vision, just flickering in and out of existence like something or someone was following my every move. I froze. My entire body stiffened. That feeling, it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. It was here. I turned around one last time, fully expecting to see someone standing behind me, a stranger, maybe even a figure in a dark coat. But again, there was nothing. The street was empty, bathed in the cold, flickering light of the street lamps. Yet I couldn't shake the sense of presence. It was like something was just beyond my reach, lurking in the corners of my vision, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And the more I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, the stronger the feeling became. I had to get home. I picked up the pace again, almost running now. The shadows stretched long in the street, but I didn't dare look back. Not anymore. Something in the air had shifted, a growing tension that made it impossible to ignore. My mind raced, my thoughts scattered like broken glass. Why was I so sure something was there? Why did it feel like it was just behind me, always a step away, always watching? When I reached my building, I didn't look back. I rushed inside, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I stood there in the hallway for a moment, listening. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. I had to fight the urge to peek out the window to see if anything or anyone was out there. I kept thinking back to the shadow I thought I'd seen. It wasn't just my imagination. It couldn't have been. It wasn't real. But it felt real. I needed to rest, to clear my mind. But that gnawing feeling stayed with me long after I crawled into bed, lingering like a bad memory. A shadow that followed me, even in the safety of my own home. Was it paranoia? Or was something truly following me? The answer would come soon enough. I didn't sleep that night. Or at least I don't think I did. My mind wouldn't shut off. Every little sound seemed amplified, as if the walls of my apartment were closing in on me. The creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of a car passing by, the occasional gust of wind rattling the window, every noise felt like a warning, a signal that something was wrong. My heart kept pounding, thudding in my chest like a drum, reminding me of what I couldn't shake from my mind. I wasn't alone. When morning came, I convinced myself it was just stress. I hadn't been sleeping well lately, and I'd been working late into the night, pushing myself too hard. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, exhausted and overworked. I told myself it was just fatigue, nothing more. But the unease wouldn't go away. The next day I went through the motions. I walked to work, taking the same route I always did. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. It should have been comforting, the normality of it all. But with every step I took, I felt it again, the prickle of awareness at the back of my neck, the uncomfortable sensation that someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the same shadow, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake it. It was as if the world had become a little more distorted, the edges of reality blurring just slightly, like the wrong frame of a photograph. I tried to push it aside, tried to focus on the tasks ahead. But the feeling followed me, like a persistent whisper in the back of my mind that refused to be ignored. Later, when I walked home that evening, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps. The street, usually so familiar, now seemed different. The shadows seemed deeper, more menacing. I could feel my pulse quicken, a knot of dread twisting in my stomach. I told myself again, it's nothing. There's no one there. But that wasn't true. I heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind me. This time it was more distinct. Slow, measured. Someone was following me. I could hear the rhythm of their steps matching mine. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. My legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. I couldn't stop walking, though. I couldn't slow down. It wasn't until I reached a familiar intersection that I dared to turn around. Nothing. The street was empty. No one was there. I stood frozen for a moment, my body tense, every nerve on edge. My mind screamed at me, it's just in your head. It's just in your head. But it didn't feel like it was in my head. The hair on my neck was standing on end. My heart was racing. I was being followed. I knew it. I quickly crossed the intersection, my pace quickening again. The footsteps followed suit, and I couldn't stop myself from running. It wasn't long before I reached my building. I hurried up the stairs, glancing over my shoulder as I reached the door. The hallways were dark and empty, but the feeling of being followed hadn't left. It was as if it had settled into my bones, a deep, gnawing sensation I couldn't escape. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, catching my breath. My palms were sweaty, my chest heaving with panic. I could still hear the footsteps in my mind, that rhythmic, deliberate sound. It was real. It had to be. I tried to convince myself it was. I even went so far as to check the apartment, just to make sure no one had snuck in. Everything was as it should be. But the unease lingered, settling in my gut like a rock. I collapsed onto the couch, trying to push it out of my mind, but it was impossible. Every creak of the floorboard, every shift in the air, felt like a threat. It was like being trapped inside my own skin, and the longer I sat there, the more I felt that presence. That thing that was following me. It wasn't until much later, when I finally started to drift off to sleep, that I realized something. It wasn't just footsteps I was hearing. It was my own footsteps, only they weren't mine. They were too slow, too deliberate, too calculated. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was dark in the room, but the silence was deafening. I held my breath, listening for the sound of those footsteps, but there was nothing. Just the deep, heavy silence of my apartment. But I knew I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling. The footsteps had stopped, but something much worse had taken their place. A silence that weighed heavily in the room, suffocating in its stillness. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. I stared into the dark, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker in the shadows. But there was nothing. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining it. That the stress from the past few days, no, weeks, was starting to catch up with me. Maybe I was finally losing my mind. But there was one thing I couldn't deny. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I sat frozen in the dark. My apartment, usually a safe haven, felt like a cage now. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, and the walls seemed to close in around me, inch by inch. I couldn't escape the overwhelming sensation that someone was standing just out of sight, waiting for me to make a move. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the reflection, but the glass remained dark. I let out a breath, trying to steady myself. It's all in your head, I told myself again, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I stood up and began pacing. There was no use sitting in this terror, not when I knew I needed answers. Maybe if I kept moving, I could outrun the fear, at least for a moment. But even as I moved through the rooms, I couldn't ignore the sense that something was just behind me. It was as if the very air had thickened, a presence that clung to every inch of space. I turned quickly, expecting to find someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. I felt ridiculous. Still, something felt. What? My footsteps echoed in the silence, unnervingly loud. I paused in the kitchen, looking out the window at the city below. The streetlights flickered faintly in the distance, casting long shadows along the sidewalk. A distant car honked, breaking the quiet night, but the sound did little to soothe me. It was then that I noticed something strange. Just outside the window, near the corner of my building, I could see a dark shape standing still in the shadows. It wasn't moving, but the darkness around it seemed almost unnatural, as if it absorbed the light from the street lamps. I squinted, trying to make sense of the shape, but before I could react, the figure vanished. Gone. No movement, no trace. Just the faintest disturbance in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed to the window, my pulse racing. I forced myself to peer out into the night. The street below was empty, as it had been a moment ago. There was nothing, no one, but I couldn't shake the image of that dark shape in my mind. The absence of it, the way it had melted into the darkness. It felt wrong. It didn't belong. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my tired eyes. Something had been there. Something that didn't want to be seen. I quickly pulled away from the window, my hands trembling. My legs felt like lead, and I could hardly stand as the air around me grew heavier. The walls seemed to close in, the corners of the room darker than before. I was suffocating. I needed to leave. I grabbed my jacket and bolted for the door, hoping the cool night air would bring some clarity, would chase away the panic that was clawing at my chest. As I reached for the doorknob, I froze. A sound, footstep, just outside my door. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder with every passing second. Someone is out there. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just in my head anymore. The footsteps, deliberate, slow, were real. I pressed my back against the door, holding my breath, praying the sound would stop, that whoever it was would leave. But it didn't stop. It was as if the person, or whatever it was, knew I was listening, knew I was waiting. And it wasn't going anywhere. The sound of footsteps was now joined by something else. A soft scraping like nails against the wood. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. It was right on the other side of the door. I could feel the weight of it pressing against the flimsy barrier between us. I backed away from the door, my heart thumping in my chest. My eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that could protect me. But there was nothing. I rushed to the bathroom, locking myself inside. The sound of scratching continued from the other side of the door, and my breathing became shallow, frantic. I pressed my back against the cold tiles, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The silence that followed felt worse than the noise. It was as if the world had come to a standstill, holding its breath, waiting for the next move. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything. The noise had stopped, but the oppressive stillness had returned. And then, a whisper. It was so faint that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. A soft voice, barely a breath. "I'm still here." I gasped, my blood running cold. It wasn't in my head. It was real. But when I looked around the bathroom, there was no one. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I strained to hear the voice again. But there was nothing. The silence seemed endless. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, trying to catch even the faintest sound. But the only thing I could hear was the rushing of my own blood, pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I wasn't imagining it. I knew that. The whisper had been real, but who was it? What was it? The question hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating my mind. I couldn't make sense of it. Every instinct told me to run, to leave this place and never look back, but something held me in place. Fear, curiosity, maybe both. I took a shaky step back from the door, my mind racing. If I didn't know who or what was outside, how could I protect myself? The thought made my skin crawl. I couldn't just stay here forever, hiding in the bathroom like a terrified animal. I had to do something. I grabbed the small, chipped hairbrush from the sink, holding it in my trembling hand like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. I needed to face whatever was outside that door. But just as I reached for the doorknob, the faintest sound stopped me in my tracks. A soft thud, then another. My stomach dropped. It was coming from inside the apartment now, inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the bathroom door again, my breath catching in my throat. The thuds were slow, rhythmic, like someone was tapping their fingers against the walls. But the sound was strange, hollow. It didn't make sense. I backed away from the door, my pulse quickening. The walls, they weren't supposed to sound like that. Were they? The entire apartment was creaking and groaning under the weight of whatever presence lingered within it. And then it came, the unmistakable sound of nails dragging against the wall. I gasped, stepping back, my heart racing. Whoever or whatever was out there was getting closer. The sounds weren't random anymore. They were deliberate, purposeful, like someone was trying to find me. I had to act. The air was thick with dread. I couldn't wait any longer. I rushed to the small window in the bathroom and yanked it open. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp, but it was a brief moment of relief. The streets below were empty, the city alive with faint sounds of distant traffic and the occasional honking horn. But there was no one on my street. No sign of any presence in the dark. I could escape through the window, but a flicker of doubt stopped me. I looked back toward the door. The thudding had stopped, but now I could hear something else, a low, guttural murmur, like a growl, low and menacing, coming from the hallway outside. It was too much. I slammed the window shut, my decision made. I couldn't leave the apartment. I wasn't going to escape through the window. But I also couldn't stay in this bathroom any longer, cowering from the unknown. Taking a deep breath, I steadied my hands. Slowly, I opened the bathroom door, holding my breath as I stepped out into the hallway. The air was thick, as if the very atmosphere in the apartment was heavy with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the walls made my heart race. I couldn't hear anything anymore. It was dead silent, but the unease remained. I crept forward one step at a time, my eyes darting across the dark apartment. The faintest sliver of light from the hallway lamp flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I had no plan, no weapon, no idea what I was up against. The fear was overwhelming, but I pushed it down, focusing on the here and now. I had to know what was happening. As I moved closer to the living room, something caught my eye, a faint movement just beyond the threshold of the hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks. A figure. For a moment, I thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But then it shifted again, and I saw it, someone standing just inside the living room, partially hidden in the darkness. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and its posture was wrong, like it was bending at an angle it shouldn't be able to. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel it. The presence of something other. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, as if some invisible force had paralyzed me in place. And then slowly, the figure took a step forward. It was moving closer. No. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I had to get out. There was no other option. But I couldn't look away. The figure was coming toward me, and I was trapped. Suddenly the lights flickered, casting the apartment into total darkness. The absence of light made everything more intense, more suffocating. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could feel it. It was close, closer than ever. And then, just as quickly as the darkness had descended, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. The room was empty. I was alone. I stood there gasping for air, my entire body shaking. What had I just seen? Was it real? I didn't know anymore. But I couldn't deny it, the terror was real. And whatever was following me was getting closer. The air in the apartment was thick with an oppressive silence. My mind was reeling from what I had just witnessed, but my body couldn't seem to stop trembling. I could barely breathe, each inhale sharp and shallow, as if the very air around me was contaminated by whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. I didn't know if I was still in reality or if I had crossed into some kind of nightmare. But I couldn't waste any more time wondering. I had to get out. But where could I go? My apartment was a cage now. Every room felt like a trap, every shadow an enemy. The hallway stretched out before me, the same hallway I had walked down countless times before. But now it was an endless corridor of dread. I had to find the source of the terror. I had to know what was following me, hunting me. I couldn't keep running from it. But at the same time, my body was screaming for me to escape. I moved forward, each step a struggle. My legs felt heavy, as if the fear itself had weighed them down. I passed the living room, the space where I had seen the figure just moments ago. The room was empty, and yet the sense of something lurking in the air still hung like a thick fog. The faint buzzing of the lights above was the only sound, but even that felt wrong. The lights blinked again, as if something was trying to disrupt the rhythm of the world around me. I moved into the kitchen, hoping to find something useful, anything. But there was nothing. Only the cold, sterile appliances that seemed so ordinary in the daytime. Now they were just objects in a dream, disconnected from the reality I once knew. I turned back toward the hallway. There was something waiting for me. I could feel it. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The faintest noise. A creak like the floorboards shifting under the weight of something or someone. I spun around, my eyes darting frantically around the dark kitchen. The shadows pressed in on me, curling and twisting like living things. My breath quickened and panic began to rise in my chest. I reached for the knife block on the counter, my fingers brushing the cold handles of the knives. I grabbed the sharpest one, the steel feeling almost comforting in my shaking hand. At least I had something now. I turned back to the hallway. The tension in the air was unbearable. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow more menacing. And then there it was again, a movement at the end of the hallway. A figure, but it wasn't human. The shape was elongated, unnatural. It moved like a wisp of smoke, shifting and writhing in the dim light. It didn't have a clear form, no face, no body. Just an endless mass of shadows and shapes that seemed to leak from the very walls themselves. I couldn't look away, my eyes locked onto it as it moved closer. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it getting closer. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my throat was dry, as if the fear had stolen my ability to speak. I had to do something. But what? How could I fight this thing? I wasn't even sure it was real. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. It was real, and it was coming for me. I took a step back, my mind racing for any escape plan. There had to be something, some way out. But the windows were too small to crawl through. The front door was too far away, and I wasn't sure I could make it. The thing, whatever it was already too close. The whispering started again, the same voice from before. It was low, almost imperceptible, but I could hear it. It was taunting me, mocking me. Run, run, run. I couldn't tell if the voice was inside my head or if it was coming from the darkness itself. But it didn't matter. I had to act. I gripped the knife tighter, feeling the cold metal dig into my palm. I didn't know if it would help, but it was all I had. The figure in the hallway seemed to pause, its form flickering as though it was unsure of its next move. I took a deep breath and lunged forward, my feet moving on instinct. I didn't look back as I ran down the hallway. I didn't need to. I could feel it, its presence pressing against me, chasing me. The air grew colder, the darkness more suffocating. My heart pounded harder, and I felt my breath catch in my throat as I reached the door. I had almost made it. But then in the corner of my eye, I saw it. The figure had stopped following me. Instead, it had appeared in front of the door, blocking my escape. It had no face, but I could feel its eyes burning into me, seeing right through me. My legs buckled beneath me, and I dropped to the floor. I couldn't move. The knife slipped from my hand and clattered on the floor, but it was pointless. Nothing could protect me now. It took a step forward. Its movements were fluid, like water, like smoke. But the cold radiating from it was unbearable, chilling me to the core. It reached out, its shape twisting, expanding into something darker, something deeper. It didn't have to speak, but somehow I could hear its voice in my mind. You're mine now. The room spun around me as the world faded. I couldn't escape. I had run out of time. The last thing I felt was the cold, nothing but cold, and the quiet whisper that filled the space between us. And then nothing. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I should have deleted it the moment I saw the subject line. Are you still trying to escape? But instead, I opened the email. It was strange how normal it looked at first. No odd attachments, no strange links, nothing that screamed danger. The email looked as though it could have been from a colleague or an acquaintance. But the chilling words were there, buried in the short body of the message, just enough to make my skin crawl. Are you still trying to escape? I stared at the screen, blinking in disbelief. I had no idea what it meant or how anyone could know that much about me. But there it was. The message plain as day. As if someone knew something I hadn't told anyone, not even my closest friends. The email address was unrecognizable, something obscure that I couldn't trace back to any known contact. I tried not to let my mind run wild with suspicions, but it was impossible. This wasn't the first time I'd gotten strange, threatening messages like this. There had been others over the past few weeks, each more unsettling than the last. I was used to getting junk mail, even the occasional spammy message from an unknown sender, but this felt different. These emails had a way of creeping into my thoughts, making me feel as though someone was watching my every move. It wasn't just the words that bothered me, it was the unsettling feeling that accompanied them. I had never told anyone about my past struggles, not even my closest friends, but somehow this person seemed to know everything. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart pounding. My mind raced. Who could have sent it? How did they know about me? The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. There were things I kept hidden, things I had tried to forget, but what if they weren't as buried as I thought? I clicked the reply button without thinking, typing quickly. Who is this? What do you want? I didn't expect a response. In fact, I half expected the whole thing to be some sort of sick prank. But when my inbox refreshed, there it was, another message, this time with a new subject line. Your past is catching up with you. The words hit me like a cold slap to the face. My pulse quickened and I felt a chill creep over me. I had to get to the bottom of this, figure out who was behind it, and why they were targeting me. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized that this wasn't just some random hacker or malicious spammer. Whoever was sending these emails knew things that only I should know. I clicked on the message, my eyes scanning the contents. I know about the things you've done, the things you've tried to hide. They won't stay buried forever. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. How did they know? I thought I had left it all behind me. The mistakes, the secrets, the guilt. But it was clear now that they had somehow uncovered it all. They knew more than I was willing to admit, and the fear that gripped me in that moment felt suffocating. I clicked the email closed, my hands trembling. But the fear didn't subside. It only grew. A feeling of dread of being watched settled over me like a heavy cloak. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to be standing there, hidden in the shadows. But no one was there. The room felt cold, too cold for the time of year. I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. This wasn't just an email. It was a message, a warning, and I didn't know how far this person would go to get what they wanted. My phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. Don't think you're safe. I'm closer than you think. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. The connection was clear now. It wasn't just the emails, it was everything. Whoever this was, they were watching me. They knew more than they should, and they weren't going to stop. I sat there for a long time, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The words kept repeating in my mind, echoing like a whisper I couldn't shake off. I'm closer than you think. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that I had no idea who this person was, or that they seemed to know far too much about me. My phone buzzed again, jolting me out of my thoughts. Another text. You think deleting the emails will stop me? It won't. I clenched my fist. The anger bubbled up, but it was immediately smothered by fear. What was this person trying to do? I couldn't understand it. No one had ever made me feel so exposed, so vulnerable. I quickly deleted the message and the email thread, as if doing so would make it all go away. But I knew better. In the pit of my stomach, I felt like something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and now there was no going back. I got up from my chair, pacing around the room. The air felt thick, heavier than usual. My thoughts swirled around, caught in a spiral of paranoia and dread. Could this just be a coincidence? Could someone have found my information by accident? The lights flickered, casting odd shadows across the room. I froze. It was just the old wiring, I told myself. But as I looked around, I couldn't help but feel like someone was in the room with me, watching me from the corners of my vision. I shook the thought away. I was alone. Still the feeling persisted, that unsettling sense of being watched. My eyes kept darting to the dark corners of the room, to the hallway outside. It was as though the house itself had become unfamiliar to me, as though something had shifted in the air and I couldn't put my finger on it. The phone buzzed again. A new message. I wasn't sure if I wanted to look at it, but I knew I had no choice. I grabbed the phone and unlocked it, almost afraid of what I might find. You thought you could hide from your past. You can't. It's only a matter of time. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The words were like a knife twisting in my gut. Whoever this was, they knew. They knew things I had buried deep inside myself, things I had tried to forget. But how? How could they possibly know about those secrets? It felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I had nowhere to turn. The phone screen glowed with an eerie light, casting shadows on my face. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think clearly. I needed to get out of the house to clear my head. But where would I go? Who could I talk to? Then another message came through, this time a single line that made my heart stop. Look outside. I froze. I hadn't even realized that I had moved closer to the window, but now I was standing there, staring out into the darkened street. My hands were shaking as I held the phone in front of me. The message felt like a command, one that I had no choice but to obey. I looked out the window. It was a quiet night, nothing unusual, just the flickering streetlight at the end of the block, casting long shadows across the empty road. No one was out there, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I walked over to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. What was this? Was I being set up? Was someone trying to scare me, or was there something more to it? I unlocked the door cautiously, stepping out onto the porch. The cold air hit me, sharp and sudden. I looked around, but there was nothing, no sign of movement, no shadow in the corner of my eye. Just the quiet hum of the night. Then I heard something. A soft rustling, faint, like the sound of footsteps on dry leaves. It was coming from the other side of the yard, near the trees. I froze, my pulse racing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence. Someone or something was out there. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My breath was shallow, my skin prickling. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though someone was standing right behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my ears. But there was no one. I stood there for a moment, the fear clawing at me, paralyzing me. What was happening? Why was this happening to me? I stepped back inside and locked the door. I didn't feel safe anymore. My house, my own sanctuary, had turned into a prison. Each room felt smaller, darker, suffocating. I grabbed my phone again, desperately hoping for a response, anything to make sense of this. Another message came through. This one was different. There were no words, just an image. It was a blurry, distorted photo of the back of my house, taken from the trees. I dropped the phone in shock. How could they have taken that picture? I hadn't seen anyone outside. I felt sick to my stomach. I grabbed the phone again, hands trembling. The message was still there. The image lingered, haunting me. And the message below it. I'm watching. I stared at the message, unable to blink, my breath caught in my throat. I'm watching. The phone felt heavier in my hand, like it was weighing me down, pulling me into a pit of suffocating dread. My mind raced, but all I could think about was the image. The blurry photo of my house taken from the trees. How had they done it? I hadn't heard any footsteps. No one had been outside when I checked. But the photo was proof. Proof that someone somewhere was close. Watching. Waiting. I tried to shake the thought away, but it clung to me like a shadow. I felt as if the walls of the house were closing in, the room getting smaller, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The silence that followed the message was deafening. I could hear nothing except my own heartbeat hammering in my chest like a war drum. I needed to do something. I needed to find out who was behind this. But the thought of confronting whoever this was, if they were even human, paralyzed me. The photo. How could someone have taken it so precisely? I had checked the yard. I was sure of it. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked to the window once again. My hands were shaking as I pulled back the curtain, peering into the darkness. The street was empty. The only movement came from the trees swaying slightly in the wind. There was no sign of anyone out there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I knew deep down that someone was out there. Someone who knew more about me than they should. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was it someone I knew? Someone I had crossed paths with in the past? The thought of my past, the things I had done, the people I had hurt, suddenly seemed to be the key to it all. Maybe they were getting revenge. I had to stop thinking like that. I was spiraling, feeding into the fear. But even as I told myself that, the knot in my stomach tightened. I couldn't ignore it. It was real. This wasn't just in my head. The phone buzzed again, and I nearly dropped it in surprise. My fingers fumbled as I unlocked it. Look outside again. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see anything that could confirm the growing suspicion in my mind. But I couldn't stop myself. Slowly I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. The night air hit me again, cold and biting, and I flinched. For a moment I stood there, frozen on the porch, scanning the yard. Nothing. The trees, the bushes, they were just as they should be. The only sound was the wind rustling through the branches. But then I noticed it. A shadow darker than the night around it shifted at the edge of the yard. I squinted, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or if someone or something was standing there just out of reach of the porch light. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my ears. The shadow moved again, almost imperceptibly, like it was reacting to my presence. My breath quickened, and I had to force myself to take another step. I was going crazy, I told myself. There was no one there. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then the shadow shifted again, this time more clearly. It was definitely a person standing motionless in the dark. My stomach dropped. I slammed the door shut, heart racing. The phone buzzed again, and I could barely bring myself to look at it. I knew it was another message. But what more could they possibly say to me? What else could they do? I hesitated, staring at the glowing screen as if it were some kind of forbidden object. Finally, I unlocked it and braced myself. The message was simple. I told you I'm close. My hand trembled as I set the phone down on the counter. My thoughts were a mess. Whoever this was, they were getting too close for comfort. I had to figure out what they wanted, what their end game was. But I didn't know where to start. I couldn't think straight. I needed to get out of the house to clear my head, but the very thought of leaving terrified me. What if they were watching me from the moment I stepped outside? What if this was their plan all along, keep me trapped, keep me isolated so I couldn't escape? I grabbed my jacket, my heart racing with each step I took toward the door. I was being irrational, I told myself. This was just a person playing mind games. But I couldn't ignore the sensation of being watched, the shadows that lurked just beyond the corner of my vision. The door creaked as I stepped outside again, but this time I didn't pause. I walked quickly down the porch steps, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was following me. The night felt heavier, oppressive, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. I made it to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I needed to drive. I needed to be somewhere else, anywhere but here. Just as I was about to get in, I heard it, a faint rustling, a soft, almost inaudible shuffle of footsteps. I spun around, my eyes scanning the yard. But there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows of the trees. And then the phone buzzed again. Leaving won't help. You can't run from me. I stood frozen, my car keys dangling from my fingertips as the words on the screen burned into my brain. Leaving won't help. You can't run from me. The voice in my head screamed at me to drive away, to leave everything behind and never look back. But every part of me was gripped by fear, and the idea of moving, of making a decision, was suffocating. The air around me felt heavier. The wind had stopped entirely, and the night was disturbingly still. Not even the trees swayed. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My mind raced, frantically searching for a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a prank, a sick joke from someone who knew how to play with my head. But deep down, I knew it was. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia. That the messages were nothing more than words on a screen, sent by some random person who had nothing better to do. But the nagging thought in the back of my mind, the one that felt like a hand around my throat, kept saying otherwise. How did they know? How could they be so precise? I slowly let go of the car keys, my fingers numb from gripping them so tightly. My body felt heavy, like it was sinking into the earth, and yet I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from the oppressive darkness that hung around me like a thick fog. But where would I go? I turned around, my eyes scanning the empty yard once more. The rustling from before had stopped. There was nothing there, only the silence. The absence of sound was more unnerving than any noise could have been. My breath came in shallow gasps as I felt the weight of it pressed down on me. I reached for my phone again, my hands trembling, but this time I didn't have to unlock it. A new message appeared on the screen, this one more sinister than the last. Look behind you. I froze, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. The words hung in the air, thick with dread. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't, but I knew I had no choice. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to, but my body betrayed me. I slowly turned my head. At first, I saw nothing but the faint outline of the trees, the darkness of the yard stretching out behind me. And then in the farthest corner, where the shadows were thickest, I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still, just beyond the light from my porch. I couldn't see its face, but the shape of it, a tall, broad figure, was unmistakable. It was there, waiting, motionless. I couldn't make out any details, but the presence of it, the sheer weight of it, made every muscle in my body lock up. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but the phone buzzed again, jolting me out of my panic. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what the next message said. But it was too late. My eyes flicked to the screen. Did you think I wouldn't find you? I always find you. I slammed the phone down onto the car hood and ran. I didn't care if I looked insane. My legs carried me forward with a speed I didn't know I had. The house, my house, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, and I had walked right into it. The sound of my shoes hitting the pavement was the only noise I could hear as I sprinted down the street, but even that sound seemed to echo back to me, distorted. My thoughts were a whirlwind, crashing against each other, but one thing was clear: I had to get away. I had to leave. The air was thick with fear, and I could feel my skin tingling, as if the very atmosphere was charged with some unseen force. Every shadow seemed to move, every flicker of light seemed to hint at something lurking just out of sight. I kept running, pushing myself harder, but the chill in the air followed me. It was as if the night itself was reaching out, pulling me back. I could feel it, that persistent presence, like a hand on my back, just waiting for me to slow down. But I couldn't. I couldn't let myself stop. Not until I was far enough away. I reached the end of the block and turned the corner, my breath ragged. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing behind me. The street was empty. I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my own heartbeat. The dread had taken root in me so deeply that even the familiar streets I had once walked without a second thought felt like a foreign landscape. I pulled my phone out of my pocket again, desperate for something, anything to calm me. My hands were slick with sweat as I unlocked the screen. There was a new message. Running won't stop me. I'm already inside. The world tilted beneath me, and I stumbled, nearly falling to my knees. The streetlights around me suddenly seemed to flicker, the light wavering in a way that was unnatural. I looked up, my eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement, but I saw nothing. My mind raced. Inside. Inside where? My heart skipped a beat as the horrifying realization hit me. My house. I turned back toward the direction I had come from, but my legs felt like lead. I was paralyzed by the thought. Was it possible? Could they really have gotten inside? Had I left the door unlocked? Had they somehow snuck in while I wasn't paying attention? A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind had shut down, and all that was left was the overwhelming fear that whatever this was, it was no longer outside. It was already in my home. I had to go back, but I couldn't, not without knowing what was waiting for me. The weight of dread dragged me down, a heavy fog that clouded my thoughts as I stood frozen on the sidewalk. The message on my phone was still fresh in my mind. I'm already inside. The idea of it, of someone or something being in my home, made my chest tighten. I could feel the panic rising, but it was like I was trapped in slow motion, unable to break free. The streets around me were eerily quiet, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath. My eyes darted back toward my house. The darkened windows stared back at me, empty, cold. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something that had crossed the line from an unknown threat into something personal. With trembling hands, I typed out a quick message to my closest friend, Jonah. He had been with me during the roughest parts of my life, always the voice of reason when everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. Maybe he would have some explanation, some logical answer to this madness. But as I finished typing, I stopped. What would I even say? How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? I couldn't just tell him that someone was inside my house, watching me. He would think I was losing it. So I hesitated, letting my phone hang in my hands, the weight of it almost as heavy as the anxiety inside me. I needed to go back to confront whatever or whoever was in my home. But fear was like a paralyzing vice, squeezing tighter and tighter with each passing second. I turned slowly, the direction I had come from now feeling like an abyss. My legs were shaking, but they carried me forward. I told myself it was the only way. The night air was biting, every breath sharp in my lungs, but it didn't seem to cool the fire of fear that blazed through me. I reached the corner of the street and glanced up. There was no one in sight, but that didn't bring me comfort. I could feel the presence, the oppressive weight of it. It was like the darkness itself was crawling closer. I reached the gate to my yard. The same gate I'd crossed earlier. But now it felt like an entryway to something unknown. Something terrible. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound more piercing than it should have been, louder than the night itself. My feet dragged as I walked up the driveway, each step heavier than the last. The house loomed in front of me, the light from the street lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. I stopped at the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The small, simple motion of turning it should have been routine, but it felt like it would lead me straight into a nightmare. I stepped inside, my heart racing in my chest. The silence hit me like a physical blow, almost suffocating in its intensity. There was no sound, no movement. The house, which had always been a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. A place where the walls themselves were closing in. I glanced around, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing. The hall was empty, bathed in the soft, yellow glow of the hallway light. The air was cool, almost unnaturally so. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, but that was it. No creaks in the floorboards, no rustling behind me. Just the cold, empty stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I took a few slow steps inside, the door clicking shut softly behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But everything in the house looked normal, too normal. Everything in its place. The messages hadn't lied, though. Someone had been here. The front door was locked just the way I had left it, but something else caught my eye. A small detail. My keys. They were on the kitchen counter. I had left them in my pocket when I ran, but now they were sitting there, neatly laid out. They weren't there when I left. I was sure of it. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I moved toward the kitchen. The keys were just a small thing, but in that moment they felt like a neon sign, screaming that something wasn't right. The kitchen, with its stainless steel appliances and neat countertops, looked pristine. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like the walls were closing in around me. I needed to keep moving. I needed to see if anything else was out of place. But something was keeping me rooted to that spot. Something whispered that the danger wasn't in what I could see, it was in what I couldn't. My heart slammed in my chest as the thought crossed my mind. What if the messages weren't just some prank? What if whoever had been sending them was already inside? What if they had been watching me the entire time? My stomach twisted at the thought, and my hands began to shake. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound. A soft rustling coming from upstairs. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was upstairs. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was locked in place, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it nearly drowned out the sound. I was no longer alone. They were here. I slowly crept toward the stairs, the floorboards creaking under my weight with every step. The footsteps from above stopped as I reached the foot of the stairs. Silence again. And then, just as I thought I might be imagining it, I heard it, soft but unmistakable. A whisper. Come upstairs. It was as if the voice was in my head, yet it was too real to ignore. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but follow the voice's command. But my body moved against my will, my feet carrying me up the stairs, each step like a drumbeat echoing in my chest. I had to know what was waiting for me. But part of me deep down knew that I might not be prepared for what I was about to find. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.